All right, folks. It's time that I finally break my silence on the situation in Niger. I'm sure you've all been dying to know what I had to say on the topic, and I have been mum because, frankly, I have not been well informed enough on the situation, so I didn't want to open my big fat mouth. But after looking into it a bit, it's not really that complicated of a story. It seems to be kind of what I thought initially. I wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything I was missing, and I don't think there is. But if I still am, please let me know. What it looks like, though, is this is a basic anti-imperial uprising against French neocolonialism. Niger was led by a man whose name I cannot pronounce. I think it's like Bazoum or something. It looks funny. And he was very friendly, as you might imagine, excuse me, to the West, particularly to France, the former colonial power. And this allows France to maintain their outsized influence in these countries. Heck, much of West Africa, former French West Africa, is still unified by a single currency, even though the French colonial administration, under which they had a unified single currency, ended, we're told, decades and decades ago. But they still have a unified currency in the same block as if they are still French West African colonies. Not sure if Niger uses the West African franc, though. But I only bring that up as an example of how the French have maintained their influence over these countries. I think that money is currency. It's one of the most important institutions in any society. And of course, the French military continues to operate in West Africa. It has never ceased. It has always been in West Africa, going back into the mists of history, by which I mean like the scramble for Africa. And even as recently as a year or two ago, it was common to hear reports about the French fighting, ISIS or Boko. I think Boko Haram was spreading into the French West African countries. I almost said territories, but that's effectively what they are. And I think the French were getting caught up even fighting Boko Haram. But definitely ISIS, so-called, the people who were pledging themselves as ISIS, wanting to take advantage of the goodwill of the name. And anyway, it seems that there is a new regime in Niger which is tired of it, and they want to end this, and they say, we're going to go our own way, and we don't want to be a puppet state anymore. So they kicked out Mr. Bazoum, who, from what I've heard, is not even black, so not a good look. I think he was an Arab, and the conflict in this part of the world between the blacks and the Arabs goes back long before colonial history, because before this part of Africa was conquered by the white man's empire, it was conquered by the Arab's empire. And so when the black man sees the Arab man team up with the white man to rule over him, there is no question he is being colonized. That is the view. Maybe if the Arab tried to juxtapose himself against the white man and on the side of the black man, that would not be the case, and they could forgive the Arabs' past indiscretions in history. But when you have the Arab team up with the white man, all that history comes back into focus. And even if everyone looked the same and spoke the same language, it still is not nice to be colonized. It's not nice to have a foreign government lording over you, making your decisions. And now the French feel so superior to Niger that after being ordered to leave the country, they're kicking them out. They're being evicted. The French ambassador and all of his staff refused to leave. They refused to accept the authority of the new regime in Niger, and they just called them putschists. But once your putsch is successful, you're a little more than a putschist. And by that logic, Napoleon was a putschist. I mean, hell, the entire French Republic is just a bunch of putschists. Because how did the French Republic come into being? Well, that's right. They overthrew their king, and they murdered him. They murdered his wife, and they murdered his children. And then they murdered everyone else who even slightly disagreed, questioned, or looked the wrong way at the authority of the Republic. That's France's history with authority. And so the French have no room to lecture Niger, and they're putschists. And so I don't come here to try and praise the new regime. They might be okay, but odds are they'll probably be terrible. Most governments, on net, are terrible. Could they be worse than the regime that the French were supporting? Perhaps, but perhaps not. But what matters here is that this was a revolution in this country against Western authority. And that's something that we haven't seen in this part of the world in a long time. It was common in the Cold War era, because back then you had the Soviets and the Chinese supporting anti-Western revolutions. They were pumping arms into Africa, pumping money, and of course sending military advisors. The Cubans, from what I recall, were integral in training and helping establish Angola. The Chinese built up Robert Mugabe. Nobody would have ever heard of Robert Mugabe if it weren't for the Chinese. I mean, hell, there was a proxy war inside of the proxy war, because you had the communist versus, last holdouts of the West, because the British abandoned the Rhodesians, but you had the Rhodesian faction within that proxy war, and then you had the communists against them. That's how they thought of it. But then within the communist faction, you had the Soviets versus the Chinese, and the Chinese ended up winning out. And after the war, the Chinese communists had to purge the Soviet communists. And of course, you had countries like Angola and Mozambique, other communist-aligned African states that rebelled against Western authority. In that case, it was the Portuguese, and then when Angola invaded Southwest Africa to try and help the blacks of Southwest Africa break away from South Africa, that was another anti-Western move, obviously. But now we're seeing it again. And then famously, you had the election of Patrice Lumumba, and then in the Congo crisis, I'm kind of going backwards in history now, the mutiny in Congo, where the black Congolese rose up and murdered their white officers. But all these rebellions against Western power, serious armed revolutions, occurred decades ago. The West, we've thought, has been able to keep a lid on Africa. Certainly since the end of the Cold War, they've made inroads with former communist-aligned countries. I mean, hell, you've got American oil companies drilling in Angola. But now the first ones to stick their necks out, to poke their heads up, is the Nigerians, perhaps we should call them. I know they're not Nigerians. And no, I'm not going to say that other N-word. No, you're not going to catch me, YouTube. Oh, no. The Nigerians are isolated. They're landlocked. They're in a desert country. And they're surrounded by Western aligned states. Now, Algeria, another former sort of communist sympathetic country, which itself was another example of Western rebellion, they will not go so far as to allow the French to launch an invasion of Niger using their airspace. So they've got a bit of a reprieve, the Nigerians do, but too many of the other countries around them perhaps would be more than happy to allow the French to lead an invasion of Niger and restore the old regime. So this will be an interesting situation to watch. It can go one of three ways. It can the rebellion could be quashed, the coup government could be overthrown, and the old regime restored by a French-led, or at the very least French-backed invasion from surrounding countries. And then, so you've got the option, okay, that either could happen or it might not happen. Then if that does happen, one, does that put any broader anti-Western sentiment in the region, does it put that to bed? Does it discourage that? Or does it provoke a wider uprising, a reaction against Western authority? Only time will tell. So don't make the mistake of looking at this and thinking that it's just relevant to Niger's own local politics. This is very much something that should be understood in the context of the global geopolitical situation. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.